Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism podcast. I'm your host, Robert Bolin. Today we have a special guest, Brian Stutzman. You may recognize him because he's appeared on what is now called Ward Radio, PKE Midnight Mormons, and other venues, discussing such things as the martyrdom of Joseph Smith and refuting the silliness of who really killed Joseph Smith. We actually have a two-part episode today. So before we kind of delve into discuss what the topics will be, Brian, how about you give a general overview of yourself? What's your background? What got you interested in, say, various aspects of, say, the martyrdom of Joseph Smith and his prophecies and so forth?
Okay. Well, I live in Idaho Falls, Idaho most of the time, and Tarpon Springs, Florida, another part of the time. And so we just got back yesterday, and I like to travel. And so I was out in Nauvoo, Warsaw area, and got really interested about 10 years ago in Warsaw. I run a telecommunication company up in Idaho Falls. Me and my wife have some real estate and 4 kids, and that gave us an opportunity to have a little flexibility. And so last time I was in, about 10 years ago, was in Nauvoo, Carthage. I noticed this town called Warsaw, and I realized that I didn't know a lot about it. And it's a home of the mob that killed Joseph Smith. And I just wanted to buy a book, and there was not one out there. And so I spent about 6-7 years and wrote the first history of Warsaw, Illinois, covered the whole period, not just the Mormon Troubles period, as it's called, and discovered some really cool stuff. And you can't really understand Nauvoo. So many members of the church watch Nauvoo, and there's 1,000 articles and books written about Nauvoo. And they go to Carthage, but very few people go to Warsaw, and that's really the third and important city. And there was nothing written, very, very little. And so, at least, so that was my foray into history, Robert. But here's what happened. 2 years ago, somebody resurrected an old, disproven theory that somehow the martyrdom of Joseph Smith was some sort of inside job, and that just makes no sense at all as we learn the facts. So I hope to cover that just a little bit in this episode, and if it's okay, I'll just start with.
Oh, you can, but just for the audience, in the show notes, I'll include a Amazon link to your book on Warsaw. And I'll also include some material the B.H. Roberts Foundation has written on Joseph Smith's martyrdom as well. So cool. I'll let you continue with your presentation.
All right. It's really good to be here. So this is a copy of the book. I think it's, I don't know, $19 or something on Amazon. Where Warsaw is. There's Nauvoo, Carthage, and Warsaw is a river town about 18 miles from Nauvoo and Carthage. It's kind of called the Tragic Triangle. Especially to dealing with the martyrdom. It's best known, at least among Latter-day Saints, as the home of the mob that killed Joseph Smith, and the lead instigator, the nemesis of Joseph Smith, and was the Warsaw was the nemesis of Nauvoo, but the nemesis of Joseph Smith had to be Thomas Sharp. He was a publisher of the Warsaw Signal. Now, this is a charcoal type drawing when he was much older, but Thomas Sharp was about 22, 23 years old when he was in Warsaw, kind of battling with the prophet in the newspapers. Thomas Sharp wrote, Joseph Smith got so mad at Thomas Sharp and the Warsaw Signal, he wrote a letter. And back then, these people, Thomas Sharp, would publish letters in his newspaper from, critics and things. And so Joseph Smith got fed up and said, hey, discontinue my paper. You can read the quote here. And Thomas Sharp responded very snidely that it printed a response underneath, said, well, we're happy to, but you've got to make sure your subscription is paid in full, or I'll send you a prophet mightier than thou to collect. So Thomas Sharp not only published the Warsaw Signal in the town of Warsaw, but he used his press to also publish other anti-Mormon books. This is Mormonism Portrayed by William Harris, and at the bottom it is published in Warsaw, Illinois at Sharp and Gamble Press in I think that says 1843. There's many years of tension between Nauvoo and the surrounding counties. Nauvoo would be called the New Settlers, and Carthage and Warsaw, that was the Old Settlers. And so in 1842, the locals got together and actually formed an anti-Mormon political party. Now, Robert, if somebody today started the anti-Catholic or the anti-Baptist political party or whatever religion, that would never fly in today's society. But back then, you could call out a particular religion and start an anti-blank political party. In this case, it was the anti-Mormon political party. And they ran candidates against Mormon candidates or Mormon-backed candidates. They also started the Warsaw legislature where they mocked the teachings of the church. And there was other mass meetings in Warsaw. And they even promoted the attempted kidnapping of Joseph Smith by people in Missouri. So why the strife? Well, some of it was political. As Nauvoo grew, the people in Warsaw's political power became less. The Mormons voted in bloc, which was very common, but for the same candidate that would protect your interests. And as Nauvoo grew, Warsaw didn't. You could be outvoted by the Mormons. So they were losing, political power both in the state and even nationally. Economic, the Mormons seemed to trade amongst themselves, as most small communities did back then. And religious, we always think of the martyrdom and the cause of the martyrdom to be completely religious, and it was much broader than that, okay? Mormons wanted their own court, their university, and militia. In fact, Thomas Sharp wrote in the newspaper, the reasons why the Mormons and the anti-Mormons cannot live together is this: the Mormons are governed by their religious leaders. Their religious leaders are also their civil magistrates and control the actions of and votes of the people with a despotic sway. Feel free to jump in if you have any questions, but in 1844, things got to a boiling point. Thomas Sharp wrote in the newspaper, and you try this today, we would not be surprised to hear Joseph Smith's dead by violent means in a short time. Probably be thrown in jail or at least indicted, or have the FBI come to your house and find out, okay, what's the setup here, Robert? Joseph Smith at the time was a candidate for U.S. president. You make a comment today about somebody, a candidate for your U.S. presidency, and you put in Thomas Sharp's words, the FBI would probably be at your door if you published it in the front page of your newspaper, right? So we know the expositor was destroyed in June 10th, and one of the people involved in the expositor, there was the Law brothers, the Foster brothers, Higbees. Charles Foster came to Warsaw 2 days later and wrote this, and they published in the paper. This is what they wrote: Mr. Sharp, I hasten to inform you of the unparalleled outrage perpetrated on our property and our rights by a ruthless, lawless, ruffian band of Mormon mobocrats under the direction of the unprincipled rich Joe Smith. And then Thomas Sharp writes underneath in the same issue of the June 12th paper, and they publish this and sent it out broadly. We only have to state that this is sufficient. War and extermination. Now, look at this word extermination. This is kind of I think today they would call it a dog whistle, is the term that some people would use. Extermination was the word that Governor Boggs, Liberal Boggs in Missouri used, right? We're going to exterminate the Mormons. So Thomas Sharp repeats that. War and extermination is inevitable. Our citizens arise, one and all. Can you stand by and sever such infernal devils to rob men of their property and their rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Let every man will make his own. Let it be made with powder and ball. So, and they sent this to Missouri. In fact, they wrote later that they they need the help from their friends in Missouri and other states to come and take care of this Joseph Smith and what they did to the expositor newspaper. So on the day of the martyrdom, a group met in Warsaw. There was a kind of a regiment from Green Plains, which is about where the W is, and in the name of Warsaw there, the ending W. Two regiments from Warsaw. They met, one from Green Plains, two from Warsaw. They met in the morning. They told everybody they were going to go kill Joseph Smith. And they went up to Golden's Point. As you can see here in the slide here, it's between Nauvoo and Carthage. It's kind of in the middle. There's a church there today, and somebody there was related to some of the Kimballs. That's where J. Golden Kimball got his name, who was later an LDS apostle. The word Golden, there was a family name there. So the mob met at Golden's Point, right? And they met, and it was about noon, and they had some speeches because Governor Ford had gone to Nauvoo, right? And he was scolding the saints, and he was in Nauvoo. This is June 27th, 1844, day of the martyrdom. He heard the mob was in Golden's Point, and he sent a messenger and told them to go home. Well, Thomas Sharp and a few others talked to the whole crowd, and some of them voted to go home, including the physician of the group and some of the Caldwells. There was the three brothers, and some Caldwells went home, some stayed. And just then, a guy named Frank Worrell wrote a note from Carthage jail. He was one of the Carthage Greys, and sent up by messenger to the mob at Golden's Point. And he says, "Now's the time to do the deed." In other words, come to Carthage and kill Joseph. So I kind of rehash this. The governor's message, they debated, and then now's the time to do the deed. So about 5 p.m., they descended on Carthage jail, and they murdered Joseph at Hyrum. And here's a couple things we need to keep in mind, especially for those who think it could possibly be an inside job. Well, Joseph was very much alive when he left the bedroom upstairs, right? What did he yell? He yelled, "Oh Lord, my God," out the window. And then he jumped or fell from the window. That was the Masonic cry for help, at least the beginning of it. It's a few more words there, but he, with proper medical treatment, he very much could have survived, but they leaned him up against the well there, and a group led by Levi Williams fired the shots that killed Joseph Smith, firing squad. Joseph had two guns upstairs in the bedroom, and as the mob came up the stairs, they were men. We know who some of them were. Joseph shot two of them. The threat wasn't inside the jail. It wasn't Taylor and Willard Richards and John Taylor, because Joseph had guns. He would have shot them. He shot where the threat was, down the hall, down the stairs. The next year, there was a grand jury composed, and they indicted 8 people, and 5 of them showed up for the trial. 3 of them didn't. 2 of them were still nursing wounds from being in the hallway. And we know it's Gallagher, Willis, and I think it was those 2 that had the shots. So, like I said, we know it's no way that it was an inside job. This is the location where the mob came back the night of the martyrdom. It was called the Fleming Tavern, and Sam Fleming ran the tavern. It was also called the Warsaw House. The mob returned at 9 o'clock from Carthage. Anne cooked, and her niece Eliza Graham, who was a member of the church and was not, was a waitress. We'll talk about this, but in June 29th, they talked about Joe Smith raised from the window and exclaimed, "Oh God, oh my God, well, oh Lord, my God," threw himself out. They talked about it in the newspaper there. July 10th, they put in the paper that Thomas Sharp writes about the murders. "We claim that the community in which we live is a law-abiding community, and that it will go down and maintain we maintain the supremacy of the law." But he goes on, he says, "We regret that we had to take the law into our own hands, but anyone familiar with the circumstances would agree we had to do this." So they admit right in the paper that they did it, and they didn't come out once and say, "Well, Taylor and Richards did it," and the grand jury didn't, said said that Taylor and Richards didn't do it. When they went to trial, Taylor and Richards didn't do it. It was the Warsaw mob that did it. They said that they were going to do it. They did it. They said that night that they did it. They put it in the paper that they did it. We know the names of the people that were most likely in the mob because the sheriff put together this list of 130 people, and 8 of them were charged. Like I said, Gallagher, Borges, and Willis were the ones that did not stand trial. The other 5 did, but they never took the stand. So the trial is really interesting. Eliza Graham testified. We can get into just a little detail here. The grand jury indicted 8, 5 showed up. They didn't have courts regularly, court cases. They had court weeks twice a year. The circuit court would come through here. They were hearing other cases. And when this case, it was called the State of Illinois versus, not John Taylor, Willard Richards. It was the State of Illinois versus Levi Williams. And they'd heard other cases, and they had a seated jury. And the defense comes up to the judge, Judge Young, Richard Young, and he says, would like a new jury. And they said, well, this is a jury that's been seated during court week. And they said, well, some may have been tainted by the Mormons. They were appointed by the county commissioners that were elected by Mormons. And the judge says, what would you like me to do? And he said, well, let's just take 12 people from the audience, right? Well, the problem is everybody in the audience had come from Warsaw or were friends of the mob. In fact, Brigham Young had told the church, gosh, Joseph was not safe in Carthage. Let's not go to the sham trial that they're going to have in Carthage. So there's no members of the church per se, except 1 or 2 witnesses. So Eliza Graham, they took this hostile audience, took members from the audience, reseated them as people on the jury. The judge says, we can't, this has never been done before where we just throw out a jury, a properly seated jury. And the defense attorney said, well, we've never had a trial like this, so we need to do it. And the judge somehow agreed. So Eliza Graham was just 19. She testified against the mob. She had served them at the Warsaw house when she was 18 as a waitress. She heard them brag. She heard them talk. Jacob Davies said that it was his gun that killed Joseph Smith. Other people made comments. When she testified, the comment was she was really good. She just remembered too much, and they just discounted her testimony, even though she was an eyewitness to people saying that they had killed Joseph Smith. All 5 were acquitted. Sharp was the first to publish about the trial right afterwards. He made up a pamphlet. Dallin Oaks and Marvin J. Hill wrote Carthage Conspiracy, which was just an incredible book. Dallin Oaks had unprecedented access to the court records as a student at University of Chicago Law, and he came down, and they didn't necessarily know he was a Mormon, but they did know that he was a law student, and they gave him access to all the records, and it was just groundbreaking work. Later on, somebody asked Thomas Sharp, did you kill Joseph Smith? And he said, well, the jury said not. Sharp served 3 terms as mayor of Warsaw, and he is buried a mile north of the Carthage jail. And most people go to Carthage and don't know that Thomas Sharp's buried just a mile north. I've been to his grave several times. Been to several people who stood trial several times to their grave. There's 2 of them buried in Warsaw. Mark Aldrich is buried out in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They had various lots in life after the martyrdom. So this kind of sums it up. 1869, John Hay, he was the son of Charles Hay, who was the doctor of for the regiment from Warsaw, the 2 regiments that went up to Colden's Point and marched on to Warsaw. he wrote a community summary because a memoir, I should say, because he was just a young child in 1844. But in 1869, he published this in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. He says there was not a man on the jury in the court in the county that did not know the defendants, meaning the five, had not done the murder, but it was not proven, and the verdict of not guilty was right in the law. This is just incredible. Let's just we talked about the Battle of Nabu. Let's just kind of skip over some of this. The Exodus is the last little part here. There was some meetings after they kind of lived okay. The non-Mormons, the old settlers, the new settlers, the Mormons, the anti-Mormons for a while, but then tensions started to flare up. And finally, in September 1845, there was a couple of conventions, the Carthage Convention. There were some down in Quincy meetings, and they decided that the Mormons must leave peaceably if possible, but leave they must. They had the Carthage Convention in October 1, 1845, where they kind of basically agreed and brokered to deal with the Mormons, and the church left February 1846. The first wave left Brigham Young, and the rest of them left later on that year. There was the Battle of Nauvoo, where locals actually shelled Nauvoo with cannons. And so we sit there and say, well, did the local mob conspire with Brigham Young to kill Joseph Smith? They sure didn't act that way. Not once did Brigham Young say, hey, you can't kick us out. We had a deal here. Or vice versa. Did the mob say, you know what, you guys can stay. You helped us get rid of Joseph Smith. There was no inside job here whatsoever. And those that purport that theory, they don't do anybody a favor, in my opinion. So that's a little bit of the story of Warsaw. I hope you found it interesting. It's worth a visit. It has a totally different feeling. I had some friends there just the other day. They said they went to Nauvoo and Carthage, and then they went to Warsaw, and it just has a totally different feeling, kind of like, well, let's just put it this way, Robert. The people in Warsaw today are wonderful people that did not have anything to do with the murder of Joseph Smith, okay? In fact, a lot of them are transplants that have come there for other reasons, because, see, Joseph Smith was murdered in 1844, and the gold rush started in 1849, right? That's how you remember it, San Francisco 49ers, right? The gold rush of 49. Well, half the people in Warsaw left to go to California for gold, and other people came in the 1850s and 60s, and then recently just Midwesterners for jobs and things have come there. But Warsaw went from 5,000 people to 1,500 people. A lot of people today there don't really understand what happened in Nauvoo. They're surprised that 200,000 members of the church come to Nauvoo every summer to see the history sites. Not very many go to Warsaw. They're a little curious to that. They also want to be known as more than the home of the mob that killed Joseph Smith. They want to be their own town with their own history, because they have a 200-year plus history, right? And the Mormon tension period was basically 1839 to 1846, so about 7 years. So they're good people. I have friends there, and but it's just got a different feeling. Some of the feelings, if you go there, some of the spirit of the mob, I think, still might be felt by some members of the church that go there, not from the local people, but just a feeling in the air. I don't know. That's what somebody just told me last week. They went there, and is that it just didn't feel like Blue or Carthage. My opinion is that it's an important history. Help us understand what the saints experienced in the Nauvoo period, good and bad. And I'm not going to say everything that the members of the church did was perfect, because they were accused, and I believe that there was some dealing. In fact, there was, because Joseph Smith excommunicated 1840s. Oops, I think we dropped you there for a second.
Yeah, you can continue. It's fine now.
All right. So I think it's well worth the study to help us understand what's happened in the Nauvoo period. for good or for bad. And Warsaw is a fascinating little river town. And I'd encourage people to, if somebody wants to buy the book, great. I'm not here to necessarily sell books, but tell the story of Warsaw. Any questions?
No, I think that's pretty good. I think he gave a good overview of the area and like kind of shut down some of the Joseph Smith was killed by Brigham or John Taylor kind of nonsense. So I think that's good. Do you want to take a break now and we can actually continue with the prophecy? So I'll take a pause, and once we are back, we'll discuss Joseph Smith's prophecies.
Do you want me to leave and